I'm excited about this. I'm thrilled. Ernesto is a phenomenal photographer, but even more than that, he's a stellar human being, and just a wonderful instructor, and so warm and wonderful. So I'm so glad we're doing this.
We're gonna be going very quickly today. 30 minutes is going to be it's going to go by really, really fast, but I do have some time afterwards. If anyone wants to stick around for some lingering questions, please, I encourage you to do that. And of course, hopefully you'll have my email if you ever have any questions and things like that. But before we get started with the demo class, I just want to talk about a couple of the classes we are offering in the spring semester. And when I talk about in the demo class, I'll talk about what specifically we might do in those classes. But essentially, we're offering a photography fundamentals class and a photographing San Diego class. The fundamentals class, we've offered it in the past, and that's really to hopefully get students with a great technical grasp of their cameras, because unfortunately, that's a big part of photography. You got to know how to push the buttons. It's not something we can really avoid. I know a lot of folks do great things with like their iPhones and their smartphones, where the camera is doing a lot of the work for you. But if you're interested in, really learning all the technical parts of the camera, how a photo gets made, what settings you use to make that photo, and how that affects the way your photo looks, that's our fundamentals class. The photographing San Diego class, we try to be a little less on the technical side, but we get caught up in a lot of great conversations based on questions, and then that very much gets us back into the technical side. But essentially, it's a class where we just try to have a ton of fun taking pictures at like these great locations and iconic locations throughout San Diego, and some like lesser known locations, some of my favorite spots that I've kind of scoped out. So yeah, if you have any more questions about those classes, you could see them on the website, or you could feel free to email me. But I wanted to get started today on one of the things I wanted to do is how to do like a quick setup for, hang on, my cat's gonna jump in the window here. How to do a quick setup for if you have a DSLR camera, or if you have what is called a mirrorless camera. I heard a little bit in the comments and chats before the class started that some people were shooting on iPhone and smartphones. So if you are doing those things, just bear with us while we kind of talk about these big old machines that we carry around with us. So one of the things that I kind of like to, a lot of my students have been really, they have a lot of questions about what is the difference between these new cameras that I see called mirrorless cameras, and what is the difference between this camera that I'm holding, which is called a DSLR. And so one of the biggest differences that you'll just notice just by looking at them is that the mirrorless camera is smaller. And so that's really good for people who do like hiking or backpacking, and they just want like a little pouch for their camera. But why is it smaller? It's a good question to ask, why is it smaller? Because if you see in my DSLR right now, you'll see that the camera has a little mirror. And when I take pictures, if I want to take a picture, you'll see that mirror kind of open and close. Every time I hit the shutter, the mirror is opening and closing. And the reason it does that is because I need to be able to look at my picture. And so the way old cameras used to operate, they used to have two lenses, one for you to look at and one for you to take the picture. And now, because this is a single lens, a DSLR, they made a little prism in here where a mirror hits the reflection of what I'm pointing at my camera, hits this mirror, goes up through this little prism, comes out through the viewfinder. That's what a DSLR is. It's got that little mirror. Mirrorless cameras, these really nice mirrorless cameras that are coming out. Sony's very popular, and now Canon's makes very popular ones. It doesn't have this little mirror, and instead it uses a computer to present this image in your viewfinder. So that's the biggest thing. And because it doesn't have the mirror, it can save some space. There's pros and cons for DSLRs and mirrorless cameras. There's big pros and cons. If you don't have one of these kind of cameras and you're looking to make the jump, my official recommendation is to look at mirrorless cameras that fit your budget. If you're on an iPhone and you're thinking, hey, I want to kind of buy like a semi-professional or like a professional camera, my recommendation would be to just look at mirrorless, because that is where the industry is heading. But right now, I'm still very much in the I'm a little stubborn that way. I'm very much DSLR kind of guy. And so, yeah, any questions about DSLR and mirrorless cameras? Because I'm going to go into some kind of buttons, some fun buttons. Okay.
If you have
So
if you have a question, just feel free to unmute yourself. I think somebody was, I saw their mouth moving.
That was me. Is there any difference in sharpness between a mirrorless and a DSLR?
we are getting into heated debate among photographers, but essentially they have very similar image sensors. It used to be that, how do I change the view here? I gotta, give me 1 second, sorry. Okay, so it used to be that because the, gotcha, perfect. Okay, it used to be that, you know, mirrorless cameras needed to be smaller, so they would pack them in with smaller sensors. So at the beginning, they would kind of, people would say like, oh, well, they're not as sharp as my nice DSLR. Now they are very comparable, especially when you talk about the vast majority of price ranges out there for these cameras. There's a huge, huge spectrum of price ranges. You can find similar sharpness qualities in both. So that's a big, big debate, but in terms of sharpness and things like that, the sensors can compete really well with each other now in the way that the cameras are being produced now.
Okay, and then I recently learned about back button focusing, and that seemed to help quite a bit. So, and I have both types of cameras, but I love the mirrorless.
Oh, gotcha.
Okay.
Oh, I'm very envious, because that's kind of, I would love to kind of just play around with two at once and kind of see that. But yeah, back button focusing, my camera does not have that. I have seen cameras that have that. But yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to look into that. Cool.
Okay, thank you.
No, thank you. So I want to do a quick setup guide for these cameras. One of the things that these cameras are really, they're very intimidating, because they're big and heavy and they have all these buttons and all these like abbreviations that sometimes they make sense, sometimes they make no sense. And I often feel like that really prohibits folks from just using it, just actually using the camera. And so one of the things people say, like, well, I know how to go on automatic. That's cool with me, but I kind of want to learn how to break free from automatic, which is what really the photography fundamentals class will help you do. And make sure my cat doesn't run all over my keyboard and kick me out of the meeting. So the photography fundamentals class that's what we try to work on. Sorry, that's my bad. If you take my class, get used to this, because he's always in the way. That's what we really try to work on. But I wanted to give a small kind of like just a small baby step for those of you who feel sort of stuck in automatic. And that's one of my favorite modes to shoot in. It's not in any bearings on someone's skill or anything. It's this camera, it's this mode called Aperture Priority. And Aperture Priority is considered like a semi-automatic, semi-manual type of shooting mode. Now, if you're confused when I say the thing, think words like shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. If you're still really not sure what those mean, I highly recommend the photography fundamentals class. But essentially, it's the three main ingredients that are going to make up your whole photo. And they all do different things. They all affect different things. Switching to aperture priority on your camera, on a Canon, it's AV. And then on Nikon, I'm not 100% sure. It's a, what is it on Nikon, Amanda? It's like a,
I think it's just A.
Okay, cool. So just A, yeah. And I think automatic is A with the square on it. Yeah, so AV for Canon, A, and I'm not sure for Sony, but you'll find it. It's usually right underneath manual. It's usually the next mode down under manual. And what this does, it's really, really cool. It lets you just adjust the aperture of your camera, and your camera says, don't worry about shutter speed. I'll go ahead and take care of that. Now, you can run into some very, very, very quick problems when your camera is doing a lot of the work for you. But if you want to practice in like a kind of late afternoon when the sun's not so harsh, but there's still a lot of sun outside, go outside to on a walk in your neighborhood or things like that, and take your camera and practice with 3 aperture values, 3 f-stops. I should say aperture is measured by this number called f-stop. But putting it on AV mode is going to tell your camera I'm going to take care of the shutter all you have to do is worry about telling me what you want the aperture to be. And doing that, you'll notice that you get to just you don't have to make all the decisions at once. You get to really just focus on one decision, which is aperture. Now, okay, so what is aperture? If you want the hour-long version, that's for the photography fundamentals class, but essentially right now, aperture, what it does is it affects your depth of field. And that means how blurry your background is or how in focus more of your photo is. And we can get a little bit more into specifics, but if you go outside and see some plants or see some toys in your house, I have a bunch of toys in my house, and try taking a photo at the lowest f-stop you can go. So my camera, the lowest it can go is 2.8. Try like a mid-range f-stop, like 6, and then try like a large f-stop, like 11, and just see what happens. And just take a picture of the same thing. This is an exercise we do in the photography fundamentals class, and just see how that affects your image. You're gonna get different versions of depth of field. So now, when you go to like a great place to photograph here in San Diego, like one of my favorite places to go with to shoot is this pier called Crystal Pier in San Diego. We didn't get to go this past class for photographing San Diego, but we most likely will go for the next class. We had done one pier, and I was like, well, we've done one pier. I'm not going to do like 5 piers and say class is over. So Crystal Pier is a great place to practice aperture because there's a lot going on. There's the sky, and there's the pier, and there's the water, and there's people walking by. So again, try practicing with 3 different f-stop values. F-stop changes your aperture. Three different values. The lowest your camera can go, whatever that is. So maybe 2.8, maybe for some folks it's 3.5. And then try like a mid-range aperture, which is like maybe 6 or 7, and then try like a large aperture, a large f-stop, like 11. So it's kind of complicated because when you talk about these things, it's backwards. I won't get into that right now in terms of small and large aperture and small and large f-stops. I'll get into that in the photography fundamentals class. So does anyone have any questions about that? Because I know it's really kind of complicated, and I often get tripped up too when I speak about them. I speak about them backwards. But essentially, does anyone have any questions about that practicing those 3 values? Okay, so one of the things I wanted to really chat about when you're working with your camera, and a lot of people I've seen this in my students when they're kind of walking around and they get frustrated because their camera, things start getting blurry, but they don't know why, because they're focusing correctly, but they're confused as to why their photo is blurry. One of the things you really need to look out for when you're holding these kind of like heavy cameras is your shutter speed and not introducing blur just by holding it. And so when I talked about when I talked about shooting in aperture priority mode, I'm holding my camera right here. I'm telling my camera, hey, can you just like figure out this shutter speed for me? Just kind of like choose whatever number you think it's going to expose this photo correctly. And when I say expose, it's going to take the photo in the best mid-range. And I understand all these words might be new to some of you folks, but so please interrupt me if I say something that you're like, I have no idea what that means. So if I take it right now, it's telling me my camera's telling me it's going to take a photo at the shutter speed is going to be 1/10 of a second. That photo is going to be blurry because if you go anything slower than, there's like a rule depending on like how big your lens is and like, what's the millimeters on your lens. But essentially, if you go slower than like 1/60, you're going to introduce blur just by holding your camera. Just by holding it. Even if you say, oh no, I got this, I'll just stand really still and just hold my breath and I'll just take the picture. Anything slower than that, you're just gonna introduce blur by holding it. So that's when I would really recommend you do one of 2 things. So you can either get yourself a tripod, which is very, very, very highly recommended for these nice heavy cameras. And what I wouldn't recommend is kind of cheaping out on your tripod. Sorry. Is because one time I talked to my friend and he gave me some great advice, and he's like, do you want a $20 tripod to hold your expensive camera? And I was like, oh, I guess you're right. I don't want a $20. I don't want to give that much faith to a $20 tripod. So that's when I would really recommend to place your camera on your tripod. I see people just walking around shooting and they come home with some really blurry photos and they're unsure why. So really pay attention to that shutter speed and sorry. My cat's about to jump right in. So really pay attention to that shutter speed. And if you see it getting slower, come on, dude. If you really, give me one second. Okay, if you're getting anything slower than 160, like 150, 140, 130, 120, you have a high probability of introducing blur just by holding your camera. Okay, so if you don't have a tripod, what should you do? If you're saying, hey, my camera is going slower than that. Well, you need to introduce a third value into taking your photos called ISO. Now, ISO has to deal with your image sensor. It's a function of your camera's body. So f-stop is a function of your lens. ISO is your image sensor in your camera. And essentially, do folks remember when you used to buy film, film would say ISO 400 on it. So that was measuring the sensitivity of the film. This measures the sensitivity of your sensor and also creates an opportunity for you to your sensor to be more sensitive to light, essentially make your photo brighter. And your ISO, my recommendation is to always start at 100 if you can, but these cameras have become so great and can handle really nice levels of ISO, even if you push it a little higher than you think it might. Sometimes if I'm walking around shooting, I'll shoot at ISO 400. So I know my shutter doesn't slow down to less than 1/60 or slower than 1/60. And I have some movement in my f-stop. So I really want some questions right now because I said a lot of stuff. I said a lot of different things right now. Are there any, who's confused? Is anyone kind of like?
I have a question.
Yes, please.
What is the relationship between the aperture and the shutter speed?
Oh, amazing question. Amazing question. So all these three things I've talked about is called an exposure triangle. Each three of these values affect each other. You change one, it's gonna affect the other. So aperture, when I talk about aperture and I want more things in focus, I want to create more of a focus in my camera. The higher my f-stop goes, this is where I get really confused. I just speak about it backwards. The higher my f-stop goes, the smaller this little iris on my lens gets. So think about your eyes. You know how sometimes you go outside and you're kind of like sun blinded. There's like too much light in your eyes. That's because you were inside and your eyes opened up to let in a lot of light. So with aperture, if you increase your aperture, you're letting in less light into your camera. So one of two things has to happen for you to properly expose your photo. You either need to increase your ISO so your image can be more, so your sensor can make your photo brighter because it is going to get darker. Or what you could do is you could slow down your shutter speed. So that's what your cameras, if you try to shoot an aperture priority, this mode I really recommend. That's what it's going to do. As you increase your f-stop, your aperture will get smaller and let in less light. So that's why your camera is going to say, hey, I need to open my shutter a little longer because I need to collect more information. I need to collect more information into my camera, into my sensor. So that's the relationship. If you go the other way, a small f-stop, like an f2.8, that means your shutter speed can go a little faster. So who asked that question? I'm sorry, I didn't see the name.
Shirley.
So Shirley, does that kind of answer my question, your question a little bit?
I understand the relationship between the aperture and the shutter speed, but I probably need to hear it about 3 times in order to really let it sink in.
Well, the thing we do in my photography fundamentals class is we don't throw it all at you at once. We throw it at you one at a time. So like we tell you what the shutter is and does, then we tell you what the aperture is and does, and then the ISO. And that gives you and that gives you, and we do exercises based on each one of them. It's really complicated. It's really complicated. I don't want you folks to kind of shy away from because it's so complicated. I will tell you, after you've practiced quite a bit, it does kind of become like a second nature to you, where you don't really think, like, you know, like when I speak Spanish, I'm not constantly translating the words in my head. I know just what they are. And if you ask me, how do you say this word in Spanish? I'd be like, I'm not sure, actually, like when you actually have to think about it. So once you're actually doing it, you're not going to be thinking, you're not going to go out to shoot crystal pier, my example for you folks. And you're not going to think about like, what's my exposure triangle going to be today? You're going to say, oh, well, I know I need more of my photo in focus, so I'm going to set my f-stop at this. And I know that I have my tripod with me, so I'll set my ISO at this. So you'll find yourself in situations where the settings will kind of just come to you, and you don't really have to think about so much exactly everything your camera is doing. If you stop and think about it, you'll know what's happening, but eventually it'll become kind of second nature to you. And it won't happen unless you go out and shoot. Like, I think sometimes the hardest thing about photography is just like getting your camera and walking out the door, or just like using it. So one of the things I did want to tell you folks today is so it's like a good place to practice. I've told you folks is Crystal Pier. That's my big recommendation when people ask me like, where's a nice place for me to go take pictures? That's like my official recommendation of where I think you should go, Crystal Pier. And what should you do when you get there? So Crystal Pier, you're kind of shooting it in a landscape photography kind of mode. So you want more of your camera in focus. So my official settings to recommend you there are f8, nice mid-range kind of f-stop that's going to get a lot of your photo in focus, and keep your ISO as low as you can go. If you have a tripod, you can go ISO 100. If you don't have a tripod, you might have to go ISO like 5 or 6, depending on how late it gets. And the best time of day I should recommend is obviously sunset. And so I would recommend getting there an hour before the sunset, and then staying at least 20 to 30 minutes after the sunsets. And then your shutter is going to vary, because your light's going to change throughout the whole time. When the sun's out and you're pointing directly at it, your shutter is going to be really fast because there's a lot of information there. As the sun gets lower and it dips, there's going to be less light, so your shutter is going to slow down quite a bit. That's why it's really good when you take these photos. My biggest, one of the things I sort of require, quote unquote require in my class, is when we share our photos, I ask everyone to share their settings, because thinking about settings and learning about settings, it really, really helps you understand what's happening when you take a photo, what your camera is doing, and what choices you have when you're taking the photo. So you make a lot of these choices, which is why I understand people's frustration being stuck in auto. So again, to kind of recap some of the stuff we've talked about, I hope I got to everything. One of the things I want to recommend to people who are kind of stuck in auto is to try some of the semi-automatic modes. That really helped me. So like Aperture Priority is one I really, really, really recommend. That's where you choose the aperture and you let the camera take care of the shutter speed. And then I really recommend trying either like a place like Crystal Pier, or just like the plants outside your garden or on your walk or something like that. Try taking pictures of the same subjects with all these different f-stops, so you could see the depths of field. You'll understand it more when you see it with your eyes. So I want to leave some time for questions, either about our upcoming classes or like a few of the tips I went through today. I know it's really, really complicated stuff, but does everyone feel like they have? Does anyone have any questions? Yes, I see some hands going up. Yes.
Hi.
Yes,
I
it
am-
sounds fantastic. Everything about the camera. I was wondering, in the course, the fundamentals course, are you going to be addressing editing? Different softwares like Lightroom. Or
Yeah. So we got into this. My class photography, photographing San Diego, the one that just ended. We got into this huge debate. Like the whole class was super cool about Lightroom Classic versus Lightroom CC. And I always kind of was giving like, oh, Lightroom CC, I've never used it. I'm sure it's okay. Then I used it for the class because they're like, hey, can you teach us Lightroom? They asked CC. And I officially, as your instructor, do not recommend Lightroom CC at all. I recommend Lightroom Classic. And yes, we do have a dedicated editing class in the fundamentals class, the Photographing San Diego class. We talk a lot about editing in our critique. Oh, I should mention this about the structure of the class, the Photographing San Diego class. It's an online hour critique of our photos. And then it's in person somewhere out, like at a location, like at Scripps Pier. That was like the first place we went. And in that hour, that online hour Zoom, yeah, I tell you a little bit about like, hey, here's where we're going today. But we do a critique, which has been very, very helpful. And we get into a lot of discussions about editing there. But in the fundamentals, we have a dedicated Lightroom Classic editing. I officially do not recommend CC because they took away a lot of tools that I thought were really valuable to Lightroom Classic. If you folks are curious, I think Lightroom CC was more of a built for kind of editing on your iPad and on your iPhone, and kind of they use a lot of, they take away a lot of stuff and they hide it in places, and I don't really like that. So yes, to answer your long answer to your question, that yes, we do.
Fantastic.
So I have another question here in the chat, but please keep the hands coming and I'll get to you folks. What time of day? I see hands, but let me see this. Let me do this chat.
I'll put a link to the two classes in the chat so you can
Okay,
find
cool.
all the information.
And okay, so why don't we go with Alice?
Yeah, hi. What kind of adjustments can one make on an iPhone in terms of?
So that is a great question. There are a lot of adjustments in terms of, so I'm looking at my iPhone right here. So if you have this thing called portrait mode, it's essentially trying to do this artificial f-stop by blurring out backgrounds. I don't know if you folks have ever played with the portrait mode on your iPhone. I don't really play with that kind of stuff. It blurs out backgrounds. And then when you go back to look at your photo, it asks you, do you want to edit this photo? And then it lets you kind of say less blurry or more blurry background. What that's doing, remember I spoke about aperture and f-stop and what that does in terms of making things more in focus and making things less in focus. That's trying to produce that. I'm not sure how it does it, but it does it like with its computer. But you can work on that. I wouldn't recommend it, to be honest, because when I see it, I can tell, like, oh, I could tell that this was in portrait mode on an iPhone. So you draw attention more to the technique rather than the photo. So, but in terms of adjustments, like your iPhone has an incredible editing software built right into it. You hit edit on a photo and it brings up these really, I'll do some light editing on my iPhone all the time. I don't always import into Lightroom CC. You hit edit on your iPhone and it brings up this huge swath of things that I don't expect any of you folks to know about, but we do get into them in the fundamentals class. Brings these things into play like highlights and shadows, blacks and whites, saturation. So it's really robust. In terms of like shutter speed and aperture, I think that there are apps that will kind of unlock those features for you, but I don't know about those personally. But when it comes to the iPhone, the editing is really where it lets you do a lot of kind of adjustments.
Isn't that editing just like the old original easy Photoshop? I mean, it's not much, the highlights, whether darken or lighten up the highlight.
Exactly. It's exactly that. It's exactly that, yeah.
It doesn't have any additional advantages other than what you can get on a cheap little program. Other than now Photoshop charges monthly.
Right, which I will happily go on a tangent about that. That you can't buy their software anymore. You can only rent their software. I saw some other hands, so I'd love to answer some more questions. Reminder that you have to unmute yourself if you are asking a question. Does anyone have any questions like about their camera? I'm happy to answer questions if you have like your camera with you and you don't know where to find something. Yeah.
I have a
Quick-
question. So I'm looking at my camera and it says manual exposure. So is that the place you want to be in order to experiment with aperture and shutter speed?
You're going to want to go one down. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah. The answer to your question is yeah. That's going to give you full control of your camera.
Right.
When people talk about exposure in your photography, they're talking about those 3 settings. Like some people will use it as a shorthand for settings, like what was your exposure? And they'll be like, oh, well, it was this, this, and this. And that's if you want full control. If you're looking at, sometimes I felt like full control might be a little too much for folks. Try using some of the semi-manual / semi-automatic, like Aperture Priority, where you only have to worry about one thing.
Right.
It's still a very valuable way of shooting. I still shoot with it a lot of times. If you're like a sports photographer, I've known sports photographers who shoot in like shutter priority because they cannot make any, they don't want to make any adjustments on their shutter speed because they say, I want my shutter speed to be at least this fast all the time, right? But yeah, so sometimes manual is just a little too confusing for folks because it's all of it at once.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. I saw another hand. I forget. Yes, please.
Just a really quick question. I feel like I might have a question for you. Would it be all right to email?
Please, yeah. Amanda, do they have my email in the class description? I'm happy to put it in the chat as well.
So the confirmation that went out with the Zoom link has his email address. You know, I emailed him and BCC'd all of you. So you have it there, but put it in the chat as well.
Yeah, I just threw it in the chat.
Okay. Excellent.
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, please email me. Please email me. I love talking about photography. I wish it wasn't so technical. I really do, which is why in the Photographing San Diego class, we sort of aim to keep it kind of like light and fun, but every critique, we always move right into a technical lesson because you'll understand that, hey, really kind of understanding these things is pretty important.
Very cool. Thanks everybody for joining us. It was really nice to see you all, and let me know if you have any questions for me. You have my email address, and hopefully we'll see you in one of the classes.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you so much for coming, folks.
Thank you
Thank
so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Amanda, thank you too.